Let's explore this official GMAT problem. To get the most out of this video, pause the recording now and solve the problem yourself. The correct answer is E. This is an assumption problem, so it's worth being very clear about what an assumption is. Let's look at a simpler argument and we'll return to this problem in a minute. If I know that all people from country X like tea, and I draw the conclusion that Henry must like tea, hopefully you can see a gap in my argument. There's a question that springs to mind. Is Henry from country X? To be more precise, I can say that the person making this argument is assuming that Henry is from country X. What this means is that there's a gap in the argument and the statement Henry is from country X fills the gap. Now, if Henry was from country X, then how would that affect things? It would strengthen the argument. So I can say that an assumption is an unstated premise. That's not the end of the story, but it will help us make progress with our original problem. Let's analyze the argument. The conclusion is the last sentence in purple, and the blue part is a premise. See my other video for more about analyzing arguments. Notice that this argument is a pretty flimsy one. The conclusion about the best way is a big claim based on not very much evidence. But we can expect the argument to have gaps when we solve an assumption problem. Let's keep in mind that an assumption is an unstated premise as we now try to eliminate answer choices. We're looking for something to support the idea that the best way to reduce air pollutant emissions is to fix upper limits. Answer A gives us some more information about the policymakers' opinions. It's kind of an extra detail about the current situation, and it doesn't have any bearing on the idea that fixing upper limits is the best way to reduce air pollution. Answer A isn't an unstated premise. I can eliminate it. Answer B reinforces the idea that taxation won't work, so it could be seen as supporting the alternative idea of using limits to reduce air pollution. Answer C tells us the policymakers favor reducing air pollution. Perhaps that would make it easier to set upper limits for those pollutants. It looks like it could strengthen the conclusion. Answer D is about economic efficiency. We don't know anything about whether the upper limits policy is economically efficient or not, so it looks like this answer doesn't support the conclusion. Answer E tells us that policymakers might not oppose the upper limits, so that seems to support the conclusion. Using the idea of an assumption as an unstated premise, we've managed to eliminate a couple of answers. We need to look closer at what an assumption is in order to go further. Let's look again at the example about Henry. Here are a couple of candidates for assumptions. The second one, that Henry is from country X, was our instinctive assumption. But what about the first one? Sure, it supports the conclusion. It's an unstated premise. But notice how it's being too specific. There's a detail about Henry being from the capital, and the person making the argument doesn't need that. It's not an assumption. And that's the final key. An assumption is an unstated premise that the argument needs. Now, the question of need is a more subtle one. That's why I left it until last. Let's look again at our original problem to see which answer the argument needs. About answer B, do we need the taxes to be ineffective? No, we don't. We already know from the argument that the policymakers oppose new taxes. We don't need another reason to eject them. About answer C, do we need the policymakers to strongly favor reductions? It seems like we need some support from the policymakers, but does it need to be strong? No. The policy of fixing upper limits could still be the best one, even if policymakers were only lukewarm in their support. Answer E is also about the policymakers' opinions. We need the policymakers to support the fixed limits policy more than they do the taxation policy. Notice how this is a kind of minimum threshold. Answer E is needed by the argument, but answer C is more than we need. The correct answer is E. To conclude, notice how we had a precise definition for an assumption with three parts. It's unstated, it's a premise, and it's necessary for the argument to work. Some other critical reasoning problems, such as strengthen and weaken ones, require us to pick the best answer from the 5 given. But assumption problems aren't like that. We have a precise definition, and only one answer will fulfill this definition. Finally, notice how answer E filled a gap in the argument. It did this by having the form of a negative sentence. It was ruling out an issue that would have destroyed the argument. Many correct answers on assumption problems have this kind of form. Check out the link below for a follow-up task.